Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion, and thanks for joining us again today. I expect there's a very large portion of you joining in from lockdown, so commiserations, and of course as always self-care as the most important thing right now in the age that we're living. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the Yalukit Willem clan of the Boonwurrung people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who happen to be joining us live today or through the replay. A particular acknowledgement to you. As always, it would be wonderful if people want to put comments, just chat, just general thoughts about the conversation that we're having today. We really appreciate that, whether you're watching live or on the replay, so please feel free to do that. I'm really interested in the questions that you come up with, because as you know, most of these sessions are totally informal, and we just go with the topic that comes up at the time. So please put your questions or comments in there. Stacey, before I get you to tell us a bit about you and why you're here on this show today, could you acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land you're coming in from?
Yeah, thank you, Bree. And I loved your very professional intro. So I am on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging from this land. And it's quite, I really like to kind of walk around the streets where I live and think about what it may have looked like hundreds of years ago, and who the traditional custodians were back then and what they were doing on the land. But it's a very beautiful part of Melbourne that I'm joining you from.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, it's a really good, I did one of those cultural walks recently, and it really opened my mind to the different, now when I walk anywhere, I do take a different perspective of my surroundings and the country that I'm walking on. So yeah, it's a good call out there. Right, well, as usual, for those who tune in often, I don't do the introduction for my guests. Some might say that that's lazy. I think it's creative. So I would love you, Stacey, to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, but really what led you to being on this show today talking about inclusion. What drives you, what motivates you, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, Bree, I feel like we could talk for ages. And we were talking the other day about how we hadn't shared each other's stories yet. So I'm sure we will learn a lot about each other soon. So where should I start? I am a consultant in social change. I'm a woman of colour. I'm Malaysian Chinese by sort of cultural heritage. I was born in Australia. I love trashy romance novels. I'm an economist by training. I'm a management consultant, formerly from PricewaterhouseCoopers. I left very early last year. I'm an intersectional feminist. And I came to D&I and sort of diversity and inclusion work through violence against women. So that was probably where it started, but then, connected all of the dots back to when I was little. So I started on this journey probably, 2013, 2012. And I remember sitting at my desk in Treasury at the time, in Victorian Treasury, and Our Watch, which I'm not sure if you know Our Watch, it's the National Organisation for the Prevention of Violence Against Women and Their Children, was established, I think, in 2013. And I remember seeing like an email announcing the launch and blah, blah, blah. And I was sitting at my desk and I used to work in sort of budget for Victorian government. And I went, this is the kind of work that I think I should be doing. I think it's really impactful. I think it's really important. What am I doing here? And so then I left to move very shortly after that to PwC and started working on violence against women work. And I asked them to send me to a conference on domestic and family violence. And it traumatized me and blew my mind as well about how prevalent violence is in our community and our society. and I mean, maybe everyone has already heard all of these statistics, but 1 in 4 women have experienced at least one incident of intimate partner violence since the age of 15. 3 in 10 women have experienced physical violence in their life. 1 in 5 women has experienced sexual violence. And I was sitting in this conference that went on for a couple of days in Sydney, and just after 2 days, and I've gone from being an economist working in public policy to this, I was like, I can't believe that this is happening, and not every single person on the street is talking about it. And the thing, like, while we're all horrified by violence against women, the thing that really gets my goat is that we have created a community, a society, an economy where it is okay for one group, based on their sex, to dominate and hurt another group. Just made that up. And so this then, leads me to gender inequality as the context for violence against women, which then led me to, well, that's not the only inequality there in the world. There are many other inequalities, including racial inequality and discrimination. And then I started working on violence against women. I became the lead for PwC's cultural diversity staff network. And so absolute privilege to lead a conversation with 8,000 staff on race and racial discrimination, and what does that look like and what does that feel like. Yes, it was in a professional context, but there's so much history and legacy around race, right? And so to unpack that, to talk about that was amazing, and talk about it not only in the, it was always a fine balance of the challenge of racial discrimination and talking about that. And we had a really fantastic, really impactful event shortly after the Christchurch shootings of people in a Muslim temple, but then also celebrating our cultural diversity and what we love about being culturally diverse. And actually, yes, there's discrimination, but this is also a great source of strength. So that was fabulous. And then I've tried to bring all of those threads together in the work that I do now. And no doubt it will continue to evolve, but I kind of bring together violence against women, racial discrimination, to work towards social change that is inclusive. And I'm really, really interested in breaking systems that perpetuate discrimination and exclusion. And which brought me to you, Bree. And, I don't know, I can't even remember what mutual friend of ours put us together, Bree. And, love to hear, about other people's work and collaborate. And that's all that I want to do, is collaborate to break entrenched systems of discrimination and oppression.
Brilliant. Such a fantastic goal, isn't it? And I think it was Louise Halliwell, actually, who introduced us, a former...
Was it Lou?
School friend of mine, yes. But yeah, I remember when we first started talking together that it just seemed such a beautiful fit, the way we both had the same approach and were angry by the same things in a way. It really coming at it from totally different angles, this idea of diversity and inclusion. And it's interesting that you say that the journey that you describe getting here, because when the work that I first started doing was in gender equality as well. And when I started doing it, it was because the organisation was trying to create, more women in leadership roles, and there was all these quite clear goals that we had. But I didn't realise until later, really, the connection, the incredibly strong connection between gender equality in the workplace and gendered violence. And I guess we do it to try and make things a little more palatable, to not have to discuss these really deeply uncomfortable things in the workplace. But the reality is, it's a great reminder that we are doing gender equality in the workplace work, because we want to break down those awful statistics, and because that's how we can break them down.
Absolutely. And then when we think about like equality, diversity and inclusion work, like there's a huge spectrum. And so, you know, I hear you when you like focus on the workplace, which is great. And that's one end of the spectrum. But there's, you know, you can work all the way along that, and you can work in, you know, inequality and discrimination in the community, sort of really grassroots community sector. You can work on it in terms of financial inclusion and financial barriers to financial inclusion. You can work on politics, public policy, like there's, you know, all different ways that you can work on gender equality. And the very, you know, a very, very pointy end is violence against women. That is, you know, a really terrible manifestation of gender inequality. And I don't work on it from a case, you know, a frontline worker type point of view. That's too much for me, but I like to work on the kind of systems, structures, place. Like I think workplaces are really important as part of those systems and structures, but I also really like to work, you know, on that big chunky stuff that will hopefully make a really big difference.
Yeah, that's a really good it's good for listeners to hear the way you've made that distinction there, because there are so many opportunities for people to engage with this work. And yeah, that's a really good point. Now, you mentioned financial inclusion there, and it's, I know, a bit of a passion project for you, and I didn't realize that you had an economist background, so now it makes a lot of sense. I don't know if she'll be watching today, but a former colleague of mine, Jane Finlay, first started talking to me about financial inclusion, particularly around students at university, the women students at university, and it really did start to blow my mind, because we weren't really doing enough in that space, and the quite awful things that were going on and that were happening, and that as a workplace we were contributing to in a way. So I'm interested to hear, to get you to describe financial inclusion and why it's a thing that we should be interested in and focusing on, and maybe we can unpick that a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm keen to hear what you were referring to as well, Bree. I'm like, oh, what was going on? And again, it's such a huge, like you could just spend your entire career and entire lifetime working on, you know, gender inequality and how that manifests in different sectors. And, you know, the framework that I use is you can look at it as an individual, you can look at it as a, you know, society, community, organizational, and then society, community. So it's kind of the three different layers of individual, organizations, and then the wider population. So if you take those kind of three lenses at an individual level, financial inclusion or exclusion, both of them, there's all of the things that we have been conditioned in terms of the way women are included or excluded in the economy and society, and from birth all the way through to death. So, you know, there's all the things about from a very young age, girls are bad at maths and they don't understand financial concepts, to I think girls earn less pocket money than boys. Girls are taught less about how to invest in their financial future. Then if you move to the workforce, then all of those, you know, there's the gender equality, there's the gender pay gap, there's the glass ceiling, there's taking off time from work to go on parental leave and not making any money at that time and not contributing to your superannuation at that time. And then, you know, there's generating wealth and assets, and the divergence between men and women continues to divide at that time. And then there's retirement, when, you know, the fastest growing cohort of people who are homeless are older women, because they haven't generated enough assets, or all the assets are in their partner's name. They haven't earned enough income over their lifetime, if at all, because they were supporting their partner's career. And then that then just continues into perpetuity. So there's a lot of things to talk about when we talk about financial inclusion and exclusion, and that's just at the individual level. Then at the organizational level, you know, there's gender pay gap, glass ceilings, promotion, retention, career development. at a society level and a public policy level. I don't know if you've heard of, gender responsive budgeting and the Gender Equality Act that requires all of this kind of compliance, but there's multiple levels of things that are going on in terms of how we think about women's economic inclusion. So we could talk about that forever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It fascinates me. And one of the examples that was raised to me in the university sector is around international students and the money, whether they're on PhD scholarships or whether they're actually then, manage to secure roles as postgraduate students, where their money is going and what access they have to the money that they're earning, and what role organisations play to try to empower some of those international students or staff to actually be able to take control of their finances and what position that leaves them in. And it was so shocking for me that, in Australia, in a way, our systems were perpetuating inequities that were coming from other countries that perhaps weren't as far along the gender equal path as we are.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in that, in terms of systemic barriers when international students arrive, and what work they can do and how much they can earn, and then then you layer on top of that sort of racial discrimination and exclusion from the labour market, and then really unscrupulous employers who there are terrible practices when it comes to paying international students, but also just young people type casualised workforce thing, which is really rife in the hospitality. We've seen some really high-profile cases in the hospitality industry of underpaying their staff. And then if you look at how that's playing out on the global stage, in terms of really low-paid migrant workers, for example, in India, who have to travel really, really far, from where they live to actually where they work, which then, and they're living in conditions which are really densely populated, then that contributes to how the pandemic is playing out in terms of equity and inclusion as well.
Yeah, wow. So much to unpick there. Yeah. All right, let's jump to another topic that I'm interested in talking to you about. And it is around people of colour, the conversation that we were having last week, I think it was, around people of colour, but specifically women of colour, LGBTIQA plus people of colour, and their participation in the diversity and inclusion space, which has become quite of interest to me, as I have seen more and more the people who are holding roles in the diversity and inclusion space or having their voices heard. And how we should be doing a lot more we work in diversity and inclusion. We have to be way more inclusive and centre the voices of people of colour. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that topic.
Oh, where do we start, Bree? Where do we start with that one? Maybe if I can start with the term women of colour. So the term women of colour, and I can point people to a new organisation that I think started last year, and they ran a workplace survey report on women of colour, that it's not, we all know that race is constructed, right? Like, it's not actually a biological thing. It's a construction. It's a social construction. And then there are so many, and you and I have had this conversation, Bree, about how do you refer to people of colour? What is the right? In the US, they talk about Black. They talk about AAPI. In the UK, they talk about BAME. And so there's lots of different terms. In PwC, we called it DCB, which is diverse cultural background. There's no actual proper terminology in the ABS. All it is country of birth, I think, in the ABS, in terms of categorizing or referring to people or language. But women of colour is a term, I'm going to try and make sure that we get this right, that came from Black women in the United States in 1977. And they coined the term women of colour as a political term. So it's not, it's a term of solidarity, and a term that is, solidarity with other women of colour who have been oppressed and minoritized. And it, embedded within that term is understandings of power. So, what was your question, Bree? It was about how do we include women of colour and how do we make sure that feminism and equity and inclusion work isn't solely white, I think.
Yes, and now you've made me want to go down that track too of that terminology. But I think that is the essence that and I've spoken on a few of these lives recently about that being a centre of what I think should really be the centre of the things that we're talking about in diversity and inclusion at the moment, because there is so much pushback from organisations not feeling brave enough to walk into that space. And I think that it is a product of the fact that there are a way huge majority of people working in the D&I space and pushing forward actions are actually white.
Yes.
And so the level of comfort there in terms of it's not just the organisation, it's the D&I people too having some difficulty stepping into that space.
Yeah. And then you and I have had the conversation and expressed frustration, Bree, about how so many people working in D&I with, really, I'm sure, good intentions, but are white men. So I'm like, I question whether they have lived experience of discrimination and oppression. And so that there is a challenge within that. If we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and I'm going to try and explain this properly and tell me if I'm just making a mess of it. But if we think about feminism and feminist history and feminist theory, it's come from a white place. So it's come from Western European rationalist thought is where the history of feminism and feminist theory has come from. And so in its very nature, it doesn't centre different types of thinking and different types of knowledge production. And I'm totally not doing this justice, but there's an amazing book by Aileen Morton Robinson, Talking Up to the White Woman, which tries to unpack how Western feminism has centred a white middle-class woman as the subject, and that it doesn't allow for other types of knowledge. So tell me if I've gone too theoretical, but I think that's really important to recognise where D&I has come from, well, particularly gender equality has come from and the work has come from, that in its intrinsically has been very Western.
Yeah.
And Koa Beck has this amazing book called White Feminism, and she goes through the whole history of white feminism in the US and how it very consciously identified with a white middle class subject in order to get greater political advantage.
I think that's a really good kind of starting point for those of us who are white working in this space to go and start really educating ourselves a lot more on that kind of historical context, and so that we're not continuing to contribute to that. I want to show up here a comment from Gloria, because we like to have the difficult conversations on this show. And Gloria is a former guest on the show who's just incredibly outstanding as a practitioner. And she's got a comment here for you around race.
Race is a political construction of power and technological function. Social construction is a whitewash definition. Now I want, Gloria, tell me more. It is, yeah, absolutely. I feel I want to invite Gloria to talk about that and unpack that. And maybe my language wasn't precise enough when I talk, when I said that race was a social construction. because underpinning that, and I think this is what you're getting to, Gloria, is that it has been very much deliberately politically constructed ideas of race. And, you know, we go right back to colonization. I'm getting really deep into the history here, right? But you know, that's where race was constructed, when we saw other people, not we, when white people saw other people and constructed race as a thing that is biologically determined to say that some people are lesser than others. I saw this amazing, this is a totally tangent, but I saw this amazing work at the NGV of this super colonial piece of artwork that shows, you know, white settlers coming to, I think, New Zealand. And, you know, it's that really typical kind of colonial artwork of Māori people in their traditional dress, you know, and it's so just colonial. And this fantastic Māori artist has kind of taken that apart and made it move and kind of deconstructed what that is. Anyway, it's amazing.
Wow. That sounds awesome. I love the depth of this conversation. It's really fascinating. And thank you, and thanks, Gloria. And maybe in the comments we'd be interested in your further thoughts on that, and maybe we'll come back to it at another episode. We are running out of time. Thanks, Peter, for your comments as well. Always got some really interesting things to say on this topic, so thanks for that. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we'll need to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Stacey. That was a really fun conversation. Stacey and I have started looking to collaborate on a few projects together, which just really builds me with a bunch of excitement, because there's so much to learn from you and the work that you do. So thank you so much for coming on this show today. And also everybody for listening in again, which is just wonderful. Your support's amazing, and the way you're sharing and commenting on these videos, I think really is creating conversations and different conversations than perhaps were being had before in this space. So thank you very much for all your interaction with these videos. As always, they're streamed to YouTube at the same time as LinkedIn and Facebook, so you can jump onto YouTube and see all the back catalogue, which really is becoming such a deep source of knowledge in this space. We've covered a lot of topics, so you can head there and have a look and catch up on some that you may have missed. And I'll be back next week. And Stacey, people can find you on LinkedIn, is it? Or is that the best place to find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, and my new consulting practice is called One Red Step. And you can find me at oneredstep.com.au. And Bree, I just thank you for all your work and openness. Like I do not profess to be an expert at anything, but I think it's really important that we continue just to have conversations, and we'll be unpacking equity, inclusion, I think, for the rest of our lives and careers.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for going with me on it today. That's great. All right, catch you all next.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you. Bye.